In the gray half-light of a North Atlantic dawn, two shadows move through snow and spray. One is new, brutal, and built to tear empires apart. The other is old, proud, and carries 20 years of history on her steel shoulders. For the sailors on board HMS Hood, this is supposed to be just another battle, dangerous, yes, but familiar. They've drilled for this moment, joked in mess halls about getting the Bismarck, written half-finished letters home. And then, in the span of a heartbeat, the pride of the Royal Navy simply vanishes. A sheet of flame, a roar that shatters the sky, and where the mighty Hood had been a moment before, there is nothing but burning fuel, falling metal, and a widening stain of oil on the sea. 3 men will live to tell the story. Over 1,400 will not. And for the rest of the century, no one will entirely agree on why she died. HMS Hood is born out of fear. Not fear of what Britain is, but fear of what she might lose. In 1916, at the Battle of Jutland, 3 British battle cruisers blow up and disappear in pillars of fire. The lesson seems brutal and simple. Speed without protection is a death sentence. The Admiralty vows never to let that happen again. Out of that promise comes a new ship design. Bigger, stronger, faster. A warship that will show the world that Britain still rules the waves. HMS Hood is laid down at the John Brown shipyard on the River Clyde in Scotland in September 1916. She's not just a ship, she's a statement. 860 feet of steel, 4 towering 15-inch gun turrets, twin funnels, and a sleek silhouette that looks fast even at anchor. When she slides down the ways in August 1918, she is one of the most powerful warships ever built, and, when commissioned in 1920, she becomes the largest warship in the world, a title she will hold for 2 decades. But inside that power is a compromise. Designers add thousands of tons of extra armor after Jutland, but they're trying to fix a design that was already in progress. Her belt armor is thick and strong, but her deck spread over several layers is still vulnerable to shells plunging down from long range. In an era when gunnery is mostly flat trajectory, it seems like a reasonable trade. Years later, in a cold strait between Iceland and Greenland, that trade may cost her everything. For now, though, no one sees a weakness. All they see is the mighty Hood. And in between the wars, that's exactly what Britain needs. A floating symbol of confidence, moving from horizon to horizon like a steel reassurance that the old empire is still very much alive. In the 1920s and 1930s, HMS Hood spends more time being seen than being fired in anger. She becomes flagship of the battle cruiser squadron, the centerpiece of the Royal Navy's show, the Flag Cruises. She steams into harbors from South Africa to Australia, New Zealand to Canada. Even the United States, gray hull, gleaming, band playing. Officers in crisp white uniforms lining the rails. To children on distant quays, she looks like something from another world. To politicians, she is a reminder that Britain can still project power anywhere on Earth. To the men serving aboard her, she is home. Steel decks that vibrate under their boots, echoing mess halls, cramped hammocks slung in long rows, a place where boys become sailors and sailors become veterans. She's more than a weapon, she's a celebrity. Newspapers print photos of the mighty Hood, making port visits. Postcards carry her image. For many Britons, she is the ship, the one name everyone knows. But prestige carries a hidden cost. While newer battleships receive full modernizations, upgraded armor, fire control systems, Radar Hood's planned reconstruction is repeatedly postponed. Money is tight. Threats are changing. There's always something more urgent. By the time another war looms on the horizon, Hood is still magnificent. But she is also older than she looks. By 1939, when World War II breaks out, HMS Hood is not just a symbol, she's a community of over 1,400 human lives. At the top is Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag from Hood's bridge, a professional, reserved officer carrying the weight of British expectations on his shoulders. Below him, Captain Ralph Kerr commands the ship itself, responsible not just for guns and engines, but for the beating human heart of the vessel. The crew is a mix of veterans and very young men. Some are career sailors who have served on Hood for years and can walk her passageways blindfolded. Others are boys barely out of school, assigned to signals, gunnery, engine rooms, mess duties. One of them is a young signalman named Ted Briggs. Like many of his shipmates, he's chosen the Navy for adventure, security, and a sense of belonging. To men like Briggs, Hood is not an abstract, capital ship. She's the smell of oil and paint. She's the echo of boots on steel ladders. She's the place where they've laughed, fought, worried, and grown up. They complain about the cold and the food. They joke about the constant drills. They pin up photos of wives and girlfriends, tape letters into lockers. But underneath it all is a quiet pride. We serve on the mighty Hood. None of them can imagine that, within 2 years, that pride will be frozen forever in a single catastrophic moment that history will replay again and again. When war comes, Hood goes from peacetime ambassador to hard-working guardian almost overnight. She joins the home fleet, patrolling the cold seas around Iceland and the Faroe Islands, hunting German raiders and protecting convoys. In September 1939, she's attacked from the air and struck by a bomb from a German Ju-88, damaging her torpedo bulge and condensers, an early warning that this old veteran is now on the front line of a new kind of war. By 1941, a new threat appears: the German battleship Bismarck. Sleek, powerful, and heavily armored, Bismarck represents the same kind of leap in design that Hood represented 2 decades earlier, but this time, the leap belongs to the enemy. In May 1941, the British Admiralty receives reports that Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen have left Norway and are heading into the North Atlantic through the Denmark Strait. Their mission: break into the convoy lanes and slaughter Allied shipping. Operation Rheinübung has begun. The order from London is clear and emotional: sink the Bismarck before she reaches the open Atlantic. Hood is chosen to intercept, alongside the brand-new battleship HMS Prince of Wales. She may be older, but she's fast, powerful, and on paper at least a match for any enemy ship afloat. To the British public, it makes sense. If something must stand in Bismarck's way, surely it should be the mighty Hood. On 22 May 1941, Hood leaves Scapa Flow. Men grab last-minute cigarettes, wave at the receding gray coastline, and settle into the familiar rhythm of watches and drills. Some write letters they will never send. Others sit in mess decks and talk about home, about football, about anything except the German battleship waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. They know this will be serious. They do not yet know that it will be final. It is the early morning of 24 May 1941. The sea in the Denmark Strait is cold, heaving, streaked with ice and mist. At 5:52 in the morning, lookouts aboard Hood and Prince of Wales report contact. 2 smudges on the horizon: Bismarck and Prince Eugen. The British ships close the range, turning slightly to bring their forward guns to bear. Men in turrets check elevation figures. Shells, each weighing nearly a ton, sit ready in hoists. In the transmitting stations deep inside the ship, crewmen quietly pass range and bearing data. At 5:52 in the morning, Hood opens fire. Her forward 15-inch guns roar, hurling bright flashes into the half-light. The deck shudders with each salvo. Prince of Wales joins in moments later. On Hood's compass platform and open bridge, officers peer into the distance as massive splashes jump around the German ships. Bismarck and Prince Eugen return fire. Great columns of water erupt near Hood. Shrapnel slashes into superstructure, starts small fires near the boat deck. Still, the British line holds its course, closing in. Admiral Holland wants to shorten the range quickly, to reduce the German advantage in long-range, plunging fire. At approximately 6 o'clock, Hood begins a turn to port, bringing her more broadside onto the enemy in order to bring all guns to bear. For a few moments, her vulnerable deck armor is more exposed. The German gunners have found her range. Then it happens. Crewmen aboard both British and German ships see a bright flash near Hood's mainmast, aft. There is a moment just long enough for the human mind to think, "That doesn't look right," and then a colossal, rising sheet of flame. A sound like the world breaking in half rolls over the water. A column of fire and smoke shoots hundreds of feet into the air, as Hood's aft magazines stacked with tons of explosive cordite detonate. The blast is so fierce that it is heard aboard ships miles away. On board Hood, there is no time for organized damage control. The ship breaks apart. Observers later recall seeing Hood's bow rise steeply as the stern vanishes in a roaring cloud of smoke and spray. In less than 3 minutes from the first explosion, the pride of the Royal Navy is gone. Signalman Ted Briggs feels the deck tilt beneath him, the world turning at an impossible angle. Water, metal, and human bodies mix in a violent rush. He is thrown clear, dragged under. Then somehow, against every statistic and every expectation, surfaces amid wreckage and burning oil. For a moment, he sees nothing of his ship except scattered debris and a patch of boiling sea where she had been. What began as a duel between great ships ends in stunned silence. On Bismarck, there is no cheering. Even the enemy understands that they have just witnessed the death of something larger than a single warship. From the moment Hood disappears beneath the waves, one question haunts the Admiralty. How could she be lost so quickly? Initial reports conclude that a shell from Bismarck penetrated Hood's deck armor and detonated the aft magazines, where propellant charges for the main guns were stored. Cordite is not forgiving. Once ignited, it doesn't simply burn, it explodes. A single hit in the wrong place could turn thousands of tons of steel into a fragmentation bomb. Investigators look at her design. As a battlecruiser, Hood traded some armor for speed, especially horizontal deck protection. At the time she was built, long-range plunging fire was considered unlikely to be accurate enough to matter. By 1941, with improved optics, fire control systems, and high-velocity guns, that assumption is dangerously outdated. For decades, historians and naval architects debate the exact path of the fatal shell. Did a 15-inch shell from Bismarck drop in at a steep angle, punch through the relatively thin deck near the mainmast, and reach the aft magazines? Did an initial hit start a fire in secondary ammunition or stored cordite that then flashed down into the magazines? Or did structural weaknesses and aging armor make Hood more vulnerable than anyone had realized? In 2001, the wreck is finally found and filmed. The footage shows Hood's remains in 3 main sections, lying at a depth of nearly 2,800 meters on the seafloor. The midships area is a twisted ruin, evidence of an enormous internal explosion. Her forward section lies shattered and peeled open. The aft end, where the magazines were located, is wrecked and scattered. Yet even with high-resolution images and modern computer simulations, experts still disagree about the exact sequence of events. What everyone agrees on is this: the explosion that destroyed Hood was not a slow, spreading fire. It was instant, overwhelming, and terminal. The ship died so fast that almost no one on board had a chance to react, let alone escape. Out of a crew of roughly 1,418 officers and men, just 3 are pulled alive from the icy waters of the Denmark Strait: Ted Briggs, William Dundas, and Robert Tilburn. Everyone else, over 1,400 lives, is gone. It is the single greatest loss of life from a British warship in the Royal Navy's history. The survivors' stories are not tales of heroics in the usual sense. They are stories of chaos, luck, and trauma. Briggs remembers clinging to wreckage, half deaf from the blast, lungs burning from inhaled fuel and seawater. Dundas recalls the cold, how it stabbed into muscles, made fingers numb, blurred the line between fighting to live and simply drifting. Tilburn thinks of the silence, the absence of the ship that had filled his entire world. 2 hours later, the destroyer HMS Electra arrives and begins to search through the debris field. Searchlights sweep over shattered lifeboats, floating timber, and oil-slicked waves. Out of all the men who had eaten breakfast aboard Hood that morning, only 3 answer when Electra's crew call out into the wind. For the families back home, the telegrams arrive with brutal simplicity: missing, presumed killed. For years, in homes across Britain and the Commonwealth, the word Hood will not mean a ship. It will mean an empty seat at the table, a photograph on the mantelpiece, a letter that ends abruptly in May 1941. The survivors carry their memories for the rest of their lives. The pride of serving on the mighty Hood, the shock of her loss, the guilt of having lived when so many did not. They become living witnesses to a story too large and too sudden to fully grasp. For 60 years, HMS Hood lies where she fell, in the cold black deep of the Irminger Basin between Iceland and Greenland. No diver visits her. The depth is too great. The only things that touch her are currents, slow rainfalls of silt, and the blind, drifting life of the deep ocean. In 2001, a team led by shipwreck hunter David Mearns finally locates the wreck using sonar and remotely operated vehicles, supported by the Royal Navy and the HMS Hood Association. When cameras descend, they reveal a grave more than a wreck. Hood's hull lies upside down, battered and torn. Her midsection is a mangled mass of metal, bent outward by the force of the explosion. Her bow lies shattered and separated from the main wreckage by over a kilometer. The images are not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There are no bright colors, no intact corridors waiting to be explored. Instead, there is a quiet, heavy sadness. Gun turrets buried in mud, twisted plating, scattered debris across the seafloor. The cameras glide over rusted steel that once held mess decks, sleeping quarters, engine rooms, spaces that were alive with noise and human presence. A Royal Navy chaplain reads a service over the site. A white ensign is dropped into the sea, drifting down through thousands of feet of water to rest near the ship's remains. For the families and the surviving shipmates, it is a kind of closure late, but deeply felt. Hood is no longer just a story in history books. She is there, in the dark, still bearing the scars of the moment that destroyed her. Even with the wreck mapped and filmed, HMS Hood refuses to give up all her secrets. Marine forensic teams analyze sonar data, high-definition video, and structural models, trying to reconstruct exactly how she died. Some argue that only the aft magazines exploded. Others suggest secondary internal collapses or damage from implosion as the hull plunged toward the seabed at terrifying speed. The state of the bow, torn apart, peeled open, raises questions. Was it ripped by rising pressure as the stern dragged the bow under? Or did another violent event occur forward? We will probably never know with absolute certainty what the gunners on Bismarck saw through their sights in the exact second before the fatal shell struck, or the precise path that shell took inside Hood's hull. But in a way, the technical mystery is only part of the story. The deeper, more human questions are the ones that linger. How did a ship that symbolized British power for 2 decades vanish in 3 minutes? How do nations absorb a loss so sudden and so visible? And what responsibility do designers, admirals, and politicians carry when symbol and reality no longer match, when a famous ship is not as invincible as the public believes? For the Royal Navy, the answer to Hood's loss is partly emotional and partly operational. Within days, the order goes out. Sink the Bismarck. The hunt that follows is driven not just by strategy, but by grief and a demand for justice. Bismarck will be destroyed 3 days later, taking over 2,000 German sailors with her. The ocean, as always, keeps the final balance sheet. In the end, the story of HMS Hood is not just the story of a warship that exploded in a northern strait. It's the story of what happens when human ambition, pride, and vulnerability all meet at sea. She begins as an answer to fear, a ship built to ensure that Jutland never happens again. For 20 years, she is a floating promise that Britain still commands the oceans. Sailors fall in love with her lines, with the way her decks feel under their boots, with the idea that serving on the mighty Hood means they are part of something that will outlast them. But no ship, no matter how famous, can escape the march of time or the evolution of technology. By 1941, Hood is still beautiful and still feared, but she is also outdated in ways that are hard to admit. The ocean is unforgiving to illusions. In 3 minutes on 24, May 1941, steel, tradition, and myth are tested and found mortal. 1,400 lives vanish, and with them, an entire chapter of British naval confidence. For years afterward, the name Hood will be spoken in a lower voice, with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Today, she rests in darkness, far below the waves she once ruled. Fish swim through the spaces where men once slept. Rust grows over rivets hammered by yard workers in Clydebank who are long gone themselves. The currents move past her wreck without judgment. What remains for us is not the illusion of invincibility, but the reality of sacrifice. Hood reminds us that behind every mighty ship are ordinary people, signalmen, cooks, machinists, officers who live and die inside those steel walls. And she leaves us with a simple, hard truth. Empires fade. Technologies age. Pride can blind. But memory, if we choose to keep it honestly, can turn even a shattered hull on a distant seafloor into something more than a relic. It can turn it into a warning. And perhaps, if we listen carefully enough, into a kind of quiet promise that the lives lost in those 3 minutes will not be forgotten, as long as we are still willing to tell their story.